First Hive are very excited to bring to you this very exciting session on the importance of customer identity in shifting digital landscape in association with Customer Data Platform Institute. We are being joined today by David Raab, founder and CEO, Customer Data Platform. Customer Data Platform is leading body that educates marketers and technologists from around the globe on customer data practices and customer data management. In fact, David founded and coined the term customer data platform as a solution technology and a category back in 2013. Prior to having founded Customer Data Platform Institute, David has spent many years as a marketer himself, as well as a marketing technologist and an industry analyst. David has also authored over 100 of articles on marketing and addresses audiences in various forums around the world. David is being joined by Aditya Bhamitipati, founder and CEO of First Hive. Having founded and scaled a full stack customer data platform, Aditya brings with himself first-hand experiences and many stories of brands across financial services, retail, and distribution on how they used a customer data platform to not only solve customer experience delivery challenges, but also clock unprecedented level of growth. We are very excited for both of you to join us. A very warm welcome. So before I hand over to you, Aditya, a quick session overview. I know you will be setting the context of the entire webinar and sharing with us the significance of why at First Hive we've chosen this topic to cover during this webinar and its significance to the current marketing landscape. The session overflow will be such that David will be sharing with the audiences industry insights on why CDP is the preferred solution among marketers for a leading unified customer marketing strategy, followed by a short section on First Hive unification capability, which will be covered by Aditya. Then both the speakers will be jumping into a fireside chat. And the last 10 minutes of the webinar has been reserved for audience questions. Having said that, please do not hold back your questions for the last 10 minutes alone. You will see a Q&A feature right at the bottom of your screens. Keep those questions coming. All right, without any further delay, over to you, Aditya.
Okay, excellent. And Jashan, thank you so much, David. It's wonderful to be back on a call with you. It's been a while and really happy to kind of do this with you. Everyone has been, all of us here, I'm sure who've been on the call have been through this journey, and we've all had a ringside view to the transformation that we've seen from a customer marketing, customer experience standpoint that has happened in the last 2 decades, if not longer. With the ushering in of many more interfaces, devices, channels of engagement. A consumer marketing brand today truly has to really deal with a multi-headed Hydra ecosystem in terms of where consumers touch it, and you need the capacity to be able to really deal with what we call internally as an identity in motion, right? Because the initial tools that came up were dealing with more like a static user identity, where you would have a user ID, all information about the user kind of goes back into that, and then you are then looking at retrospectively segmenting this information to go back and target conversations. But in today's era, whether it is with mobile applications, social ads, your own customer support, any of the other support channels that you have, whether it's web or chat and so on, what we're essentially seeing is consumers leave their different breadcrumbs, and they leave different intent information across different channels. And in all of this, how does the brand go back and say, look, how do I deliver to you that connected customer experience? And for that, the ability to pull together all of these disparate sources and get to that single unified ID becomes extremely crucial. It's in fact table stakes for you to be able to do anything meaningful. And that is really what brings us to how does a CDP come in there, and how does this really become the key to unlocking that capability in the organization? And so, David, of course, has done a lot of path-breaking, provided path-breaking thought leadership for all of us here in this space, and And this becomes even more critical in view of the regulatory environment, which is encouraging brands to become a lot more responsible for their first party data. And consumers are expecting brands to be more responsible with the consent-backed data that they're getting access to. And in many ways, the brand's ability to deal with this data and the way they demonstrate their understanding of the customer is now becoming a barometer of trust that a consumer can place on the brand. And therefore, in view of all of this, we look forward to this new era where CDP really becomes your critical unlocking capability of being able to deliver on those expectations, whether it is on the enterprise's own customer experience goals, a consumer's expectations on the brand experience that they intend to have, or even from a basic compliance standpoint in terms of how do you deal with all of the data that you're responsible for. And so David, this is where I hand over the baton to you to walk us through your thoughts on how does the CDP really come in and unlock that capability for the enterprise, and why is this such a critical capability for an enterprise, given all the other digital transformation initiatives that an enterprise is going through? How does this become the real critical enabler in all of this?
Great. Well, thank you. You've laid it out extremely well for everyone as to why we are doing these things. And we'll talk a little now about indeed what's going on in the industry. And hopefully you are seeing my screen. Yes, good. All right. So let's talk about why B2C marketers need a CDP. And we'll actually start, speaking of customer expectations, with my own experience, which is about a year ago, I actually bought a kayak. Now, this was still during the COVID, so we ordered it online, and the store that we dealt with had no doubt done a huge amount of work to make everything work differently from the way it had worked before. So we were able to drive over to the local store and pick up said kayak, and the experience was actually quite seamless. They did an excellent job. And we got home and we were very happy with our little kayak, and we're out paddling around. But then I begin to see every place I go on the internet ads for that same kayak from that same store. And of course, we've all experienced this. It's called retargeting, as you all know. And there are a few things that annoy customers more than being offered an ad for something that they've just bought. And you say to yourself, well, why didn't this company know that I just bought this? I bought it from them. I paid with a credit card. They have all my information. They certainly should know not to be pestering me with more ads for kayaks. I don't probably need another kayak. In fact, we'd already bought two, one for my wife and myself. And we're probably not going to need a third one anytime soon, unless they know something about these kayaks sinking that I don't know. And the kayak is alive and well, incidentally, like a year later. So that was not an issue. And this is simply an example of why we need customer data platforms, because we expect as consumers that the company is going to know that, hey, I already bought this from you. Don't pester me with ads about it again. And the way that you connect the one thing to the other is you have a CDP that has the purchase in the purchasing system that tells the advertising system, hey, take this guy off your retargeting list because he's already bought from you. But if you don't have those two systems connected, or if you don't connect them through the CDP, you're going to make this problem and annoy your customers. So in a nutshell, this is why you want a CDP. And the question then is, well, what's so hard about that? What is so hard about getting the data from the purchasing system into the retargeting system? And in particular, what's so hard about building the single customer view, which is in the CDP, which is the two systems that connect the one, which is what connects the one system to the other system? Well, it turns out it is pretty easy. When we draw the picture of a CDP, it looks really simple, right? It looks kind of like this. This is sometimes called a butterfly diagram, or I think of it as the squashed spider diagram. But in any event, you have all your sources on one side, all your distribution or delivery systems on the other side, and inside is this nice little box that's labeled CDP. Looks pretty simple, right? until you open that box up. And when you get up inside that box, it turns out it's actually not such a simple little box. There's actually a lot going on inside that box. You have to capture the data. You have to ingest it into some sort of a data store. You have to clean it. You have to then store it properly. You then have to do the linking that connects my cookie, which is what the retargeting system knows about, with my purchase history, which is what the purchase system knows about, and realize that's the same person. You then have to aggregate that information. You have to share it out to the other systems. You have to integrate those with those other systems. Then you have to do segmentation, do other things. So there actually are quite a few steps that you need to go through inside that very simple looking CDP box to make this thing happen. So and more than that, every step is complicated. Here's just the first step alone. You're going to have to look at, where's the data going to come from? Is it going to come in through tags? Is it come in through an API, through an SDK? Is it going to be streaming data? Am I going to do file imports? What kind of data will it be? Well, if it's text data, will it be structured, unstructured, semi-structured? If it's not text, nowadays we have to worry about images and audios and videos, and soon we'll be dealing with augmented reality and virtual reality, and God knows only what other data sources and data formats we're going to be coming up with. So every one of the steps, I won't go through them all, you'll be pleased to know, every one of those steps is complicated. So there is indeed a great deal going on. And just to raise the stakes a tad, any gap, any failed connection between one step and the next means the chain is broken and the system doesn't work. So we have to do a lot of things. We have to get them all just right. And that is not easy. And this is why we have CDPs, because the CDPs solve that problem. At least they're designed to solve that problem, which then, of course, begs the question, well, why or how does the CDP solve this problem? We just saw all those steps inside the CDP. What's going to make that happen in the CDP? Well, let's first define a CDP. The definition, the official CDP Institute definition of CDP is packaged software that builds a unified persistent customer database accessible to other systems, which is a lot to say. But we'll just break that apart a little. It's packaged software. You buy a CDP. Okay, it's not something that you build for yourself. It's the definition of it. You could build something similar. We'll talk a little about that later on because it's not easy. But this thing that you buy is persistent. The data is stored somewhere. It doesn't just kept for 60 days like a cookie, for example. It's unified. It pulls together a complete customer view with all the different identities that customers have in different systems. Again, the cookie, the email address, the device ID, or the postal physical address, all the different identities get pulled together so we can build this unified customer profile. And it's customer data. It's not a product view. It's not a retail location view. It's a customer view. There's lots of ways to build databases. So a very specific set of requirements actually to do what a CDP does. And then it's accessible to other systems. It shares the data because there are systems that build unified customer profiles, but just for their own purposes. A lot of personalization systems, for example, will do that, or predictive modeling systems will do that, but they weren't designed to share the data with other systems. And if you're not designed to do that, you're probably not going to be very good at it. So let's actually talk a little more here about what are all the, so that was a complicated definition. The simple thing to remember, CDPs build profiles. It's really all you have to know. That's what CDPs are. That's what CDPs do. CDPs build profiles. So just remember that, and you can forget everything else I say here today. So what makes the CDP unique? Because lots of systems have customer data in them. Okay. And people get confused. And they say, well, I have a data lake. Okay, well, data lake, it's not packaged software. And usually data lake is just all the data kind of thrown somewhere and stored. So it's not really unified in the way, it's not pulled together in the way the CDP pulls it together. Data warehouse, same thing. Again, not packaged, usually a limited number of sources into a data warehouse. Data warehouses originally really built for financial analysis. Usually didn't even have a proper customer view, although it's possible to build one with a customer view. They usually throw away some detail. They usually aggregate the data to make the analysis a little easier. So again, not the full level of detail that you store in the CDP. By definition, the CDP doesn't throw anything away. Having a data hub which is an integration platform, or a tag manager, which is a system that pulls in together. Those are packaged software that can take data from all sources. They can at least pull in the data in all the detail, but they don't store it. A data hub or an integration platform, this would be like a Boomi or a MuleSoft, just takes the data from one place and moves it onto something else, more like a switchboard, really. So again, you're not storing anywhere. And if you don't store the data persistently, which just means you store it, fancier word, if you don't store it, then you can't do things like look at a customer over time. Actually, even identity management over time is difficult if you don't store the data, because information changes. I get a new device, I get a new email address, I get a new phone number. You need to have the old stuff so you can make the connections. Okay, so if you don't store it persistently, you lose a lot of those capabilities. And obviously, if you're going to do things like tracking lifetime value, you have to have all the old transactions there to track the lifetime value. So just having an integration platform does not solve your problem. What about CRM systems or marketing automation systems or marketing clouds? Well, those really are built to deal with the data that they generate for themselves. The CRM system really is built to store notes that a salesperson or a call center agent makes about a conversation. That's really what they do. Marketing automation systems mostly send out email at the end of the day. Many of them have website tags, but they only deal with the data that they generate. So they can't import data by and large from other systems. They're simply not designed to do that. And they've structured their data structures differently to do what they're good at and not to do the other things. Data management platform, probably the most commonly confused with a CDP, even though they really have very little in common. They were sold in some places as if they were the place to store all of your first-party data. Not so much in the US, but in Europe and I think in Asia as well, actually. But DMPs are really built to select advertising audiences. That's what they do. And really are built to deal with cookies in particular. So you structure it again that way because you have billions and billions of rows in these things. And you have a big flat file. So you throw away some detail to make the data kind of manageable when you have that many rows, when you have that many entities in it. So again, not quite built for that. Limited number of sources. Again, throws away detail to summarize it so you can do your selections quickly. Typically, if you're storing cookies, again, you're not going to store the data for very long. You know, drop your cookies in 30 or 60 or 90 days. Not a lot of unification across all those fancier identifiers going on. So DMP is very, very limited actual capability. And now with privacy rules making third-party cookies limited in their future lifespan, DMPs are actually kind of struggling right now to find a new purpose in life. Some of them are repositioning as CDPs, which if they've re-engineered their entire system is good. If they've just changed the label and not changed the underlying technology, not so good, because it's not going to be able to do what you want your CDP to do. Email systems, content management systems, these are executional systems. These are systems that deliver messages to people. They're really not designed to do what a CDP does at all. Very, very limited data storage, so they don't really tick almost any of the boxes here. So the point of this is not that those bad systems are bad and CDP is good. Those are all good systems. They're all just built for something else. Every one of those systems is optimized for its purpose, whether that purpose is to serve advertisements or to send emails or to move data from one place or another, or to just to be a big data store. They're all built for that. But the CDP is the only one of those systems that's optimized to create a complete shareable single customer view. It's the only one that's really optimized to build profile. So if you want to build profiles, if you want to combine data from different sources and put it in one place and then share it out, you're really going to need a CDP. Next question. Okay, great. I need a CDP. Can I just build it? Why do I have to buy this thing? It's a pain in the neck to buy things. I'd rather just build my own. And well, let's talk about that, okay? Because this is a major topic of discussion in the industry right now. And we have that whole little list of all the processes that have all the steps in the CDP. So here's that same list again. Each one of those steps actually relates to a particular type of system. So I could buy a tag manager and a pipeline system and a data quality system and a database system and an ID resolution system, and a master data management system, and maybe reverse ETL tool. And I'll buy an orchestration engine. I'll buy some analytical tools. Yeah, I could buy all of those. And then I could just integrate them. How long is that going to take? How much work is involved? Hard enough to buy one system. Now you're going to buy all these systems. You're going to get, and there's multiple choices in every one of those categories, mind you. So you're going to actually have to spend some effort picking the right tool. Then you have to train your people. Then you're going to have to connect and integrate all those systems. And then heaven forbid there's a change anywhere, because now you have to go and re-engineer every one of those integrations to accommodate this new data element or whatever happens. So it's a huge amount of work. And that's if you can buy these components. Of course, if you want to build any one of these components from scratch, it's even more work, because now you have to put your developers on it. So yeah, you could maybe build it if you really want to. And if you really want to get into it, there's all kinds of analyses that you can go through, because the integration cost is just one of it. And we won't bother to go through every one of these items here, because it would take more time than and probably more patience than you have. But there's a lot of issues. So at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is it's not that you would never want to build, but you would build your own system for a couple of reasons. If you really can't find a suitable package system, okay, and your existing resources are pretty close. There are companies that have really good customer data infrastructures in place. They've already built good customer data warehouses. Financial services, we see this often because they've had to do a lot of the work for know your customer and anti-fraud and things like that. So they actually often have a very robust customer data infrastructure, and their IT people understand how to work with customer data, which in many other industries they don't. Okay, so if you got a lot, the incremental cost to extend is kind of modest. And it's worth thinking if still also that build system is going to give you some competitive advantage. Okay, because otherwise you might as well just buy it. And you have the developers available to do the work, which you may or may not have. And again, there's a lot of work involved in building your own system, or even if you're just connecting purchased components. And that's the best use for those developers, because there's lots of reasons that people want developers to work on a system. There's lots of things for developers to do. They're always a scarce resource. I don't care how big your company is and how many developers it has, there's always more work than you have developers to do the work. So is this the best use? And if I can buy something that does what I need and free up those developers to build something else that I can't buy, that's probably the better use for those developers' time. So it's not that you would never, ever build a system. There are situations where it makes sense to build the equivalent of a CDP. And let me just be a little pedantic here. CDPs are packaged software by definition. So you can't build a CDP because you can't build your own packaged software. It simply is logically impossible. You could build the equivalent of a CDP, okay? Functional equivalent is what you would do, and that's okay. I mean, who cares about the labels? But you really want to think long and hard. And ultimately, the one question to ask, and again, we just looked at a whole bunch of real detailed stuff here, is like, how quickly can they do it? Can they deliver that thing that you want functionally and in a reasonable amount of time? Okay, the sign that we see here is like every IT department in the world used to have it on the wall, and it's kind of a true thing. They're like, you're never going to get these things as quickly as you want it. So, summarize what we said here. Single customer view requires many steps, many functions to deliver. It's not an easy thing to build. And your system is going to fail if any of those gaps remain open. So you have to do them all. The CDP is the only system that's designed to fill every one of those gaps in one system. And think very, very carefully before trying to build your own equivalent. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, David, thank you. That was quite insightful, and I think you touched upon some very, very good questions that typically come up in these conversations very proactively. But I'm sure I'm already seeing a few questions that are coming up on that. But before we get to the Q&A, because I do want to, I think, given the relevance of the topic, maybe we'll spend a lot more time on the Q&A. But I did want to talk specifically about one thing, which is, the whole CDP creates profiles. I think that's a very, very good way of looking at the fundamental value proposition of a CDP. Of course, you have, breadth of capabilities that come in from what we would call as, let's say, the CDP core and, the full stack capabilities. But I think when you touch upon the CDP core capability as really being able to create those profiles and the persistent identities, I think that is where, as you're aware, we've done some very interesting things at First Hive. For example, we became the first CDP that started looking at persistency at an interaction level, which is, how do you give out of the box a time series trail of interaction identities, because consumers are not unified, homogeneous entities which will always respond to every interaction of a brand in the same manner. And therefore, what each of us really is we're all a collection of personas that we demonstrated across various contexts that we've had interaction with a brand. And therefore, when you look at what is the role of a profile within an enterprise, why does an enterprise want a profile in the first place, right? There are, at least the way we see it, there are really two reasons. One, because I'm expected to take control of my data. But two, because I want to be able to have better conversations with you. If I know you, I'm better placed to have a better conversation, a more relevant, contextual, cohesive, consistent conversation with you. And the reason we need to do that is because then I expect that I'm placing relevant content at the right time, on the right channel, in the right form factor, and so on, which is more likely to result in an intended action from the consumer, because I understand your intent, I'm able to understand your requirement, and so on and so forth. So the need for a profile is driven by these two things. A, I need to get control of my data, and B, I want to be able to use the insight that I can draw from this profile to be able to have meaningful conversations that will result in the intended outcomes. And that is where the historical profile approach versus the CDP approach to a profile is fundamentally very different. I think the largest foundation of how tools in general have looked at profiles has been the CRM approach to a profile, which is you have a user has a known identity vector like an email or a mobile, and that is really your profile. And then that is what starts getting more and more, let's say, enriched, which is to say that David.Raab@gmail, let's say that's your email, is always going to be the same person, no matter when, what, where you're talking to me as a brand. And then I'll just keep enriching that information with more and more content. But the reality is you're not that. In your example of Dick's Sporting Goods, your interaction was for a kayak versus you want to go maybe the next time and get your golf clubs from there, and the third time you're probably just doing something else. So the context really determines the cycle of conversation. Maybe when you reach a support line, you need something else. Your requirement is something else versus when you're exploring. So how does that really weave back into the enterprise where the context is embedded in your interaction, not as a user, but as an interaction? And therefore, the trail of identities, which is the ability for an enterprise to recognize that you're actually an identity in motion. And what is really changing is the context. And for me to therefore know what I should talk with you as a brand the next time, I need to understand the current context and the historical context and your behavior in those respective contexts for me to be able to predict better. And that is where First Hive's unification approach is so fundamentally different from a typical CRM approach of identities, which is to create these time series trails where the persistent identity is not the user. The persistent identity is those individual pearls of interactions that are really coming from the customer, and how do those get weaved into that unified view of the customer. So when the analytic teams come in, they actually have access to all of the raw data. But you know, I really like the succinct manner in which you put in, which is that the CDP really has to differentiate itself at the profile level, because that's really the core value out of the CDP, which is how do you deliver insight on the customer understanding, so you can then do every downstream action, and you have to be able to then allow for permeation of this data and insight into every downstream operation that impacts customer experience, which means all the different tools, all the different interfaces. How do you allow for portability of this insight and data? But some really, really good points. You know, what I would want to do now is make sure that we are giving adequate time, because I already have a whole bunch of questions which are streaming in. So let me switch to the questions, David, and you know, we'll try and take each of these questions and then maybe spend a minute or two on these. And I'm sure the audience would love to hear from you. The first question is, saying that, you know, since the time you coined the term CDP to now, how do you see the evolution in the last decade, and how do you what do you think about it, and you know, what do you see ahead? What are some of the trends that you're seeing ahead? And that trends bit is something that I'm adding on, but you know, how do you see this evolving given what you've seen in the last few years?
Okay, well, it's been a long time now, almost 10 years, and as you can imagine, many things have indeed changed, I think. But when we started, people were still not too clear what this thing was and why we needed it. In particular, they thought they could just go out and gather the data on the fly from all the source systems. And they didn't even see why we needed yet another database, right? And that was the big question. You still get that question occasionally. But experience has proven kind of the hard way that you can't just go out and assemble profiles on the fly by querying the source systems for any number of reasons. You really do have to put that data in one place so that you can clean it up and massage it and analyze it and get the time series put in place properly. So what's happened since that fundamental understanding was reached was a lot of companies that were building profiles for their own purposes because they really wanted to do predictive modeling, say, and they said, I got to build profiles because we need data to feed our predictive models. Realized that there was more value in those profiles they were building than in their predictive modeling algorithms, which everyone's unique, and we don't want to disrespect anyone who has a favorite predictive modeling algorithm, but they're not that different. A lot of predictive modeling algorithms there, they all work not that far apart. So a lot of the vendors who started out just building a database sort of as a little supporting feature for the thing they really wanted to sell, which was the application, kind of realized, hey, there's more value in that database. So we get a lot of vendors as a result calling themselves CDPs, and that's one of the reasons that we have our little set of check boxes for what makes somebody a real CDP or not, because you have to have all the data, not just some of the data. You have to keep it for as long as you want to keep it, not throw it away. You have to keep all the detail, all the things that we look for. So there's been, I think, a growth and a bit of confusion in the industry. Other things that have changed, again, I talked earlier how some industries had fairly decent customer data, like financial services and telcos also. So they were a little slow to adopt CDP because they kind of had more of it in place already. They had, as opposed to retail and media, which were the first two industries which generally had no data at all. So they had the most pressing need, and they also actually had the most short-term transactions, so it was easy to see the value of the CDP immediately. So it's different industries have been coming on board in kind of waves. The second wave was those financial services, telco, travel. There's a third wave of education and healthcare and things that are even trickier from a data standpoint, and even fewer transactions, but larger ones. So that's been changed. So there's been more vertical spread. There's been specialization. Every one of those industries tends to have its own CDP vendors who integrate more tight with the operations. That's the third thing. Maybe that's the fourth thing, is tighter integration of the CDP with operations, not just marketing and use of CDP throughout the organization, not just as a marketing resource, which is where it mostly started. So there have been some sort of fundamental changes in how CDPs are used and who uses them. Interestingly, the technology hasn't really evolved. 10 years, you would think, is forever in technology terms, but you were using NoSQL databases then, you're using NoSQL databases now. We see a few different things like Snowflake and Databricks coming up that weren't available 10 years ago, a little more flexible, but that doesn't really change anything fundamentally. And I guess the only other big thing is this whole build versus buy debate that we talked about earlier. I think I spent a lot of time on. There's more people saying, why can't I just build it? And there's more vendors out there who are trying to convince you that, yeah, sure, just buy my tool and a dozen other tools and you can just build your own. And as I say, I at least think that's something to consider long and hard before you go down that direction.
Got it. Thank you for that. Hopefully that that answers some of the questions. Any thoughts in terms of, just to extend that a little bit, right? As you look ahead, what do you think will be the largest thrust area of evolution from a CDP standpoint in the next decade?
Well, I think what's actually going to happen, and I'm not sure everybody would agree on this, is the CDPs will just continue to expand their scope. Again, the core function of the CDP course is to build profiles. But if we look at the industry, 2/3, 75% of the industry is CDPs that also do analytics and do campaign management. And we now even see more CDPs who have integrated their own delivery systems like email or website personalization. Those are not core, because you can go out and buy perfectly fine campaign management and email systems and analytical systems. But for the same logic that says it's easier to buy one CDP than a dozen point solutions, it's easier to buy one CDP than a CDP plus an email system plus predictive modeling system. So the market has kind of spoken quite clearly, actually. And so we want as many features as possible in a single system. And this has historically happened in every segment I've ever seen. People build suites, and you look at the big marketing suite. So we see the CDPs as integrated into larger packages. It's probably the main thing that's going to be happening over the next few years, and of course new channels and everything else. But I think that's really where the industry is headed.
Got it. Yeah, I would kind of tend to agree with that. We've seen that as well, and I think that's been one of the things that First Dive has done, which is while we delivered the core CDP capability, we've gone ahead and expanded the capabilities from ingestion to identity, delivery of that data to be able to push it to any destination systems, the segmentation capability, analytics capability, cloud data warehouse within the First Dive environment that we're able to deploy, and the ability to bring your own ML from the analytics standpoint, and of course the delivery integrations as well. So yeah, we completely agree. And the interesting thing is we've seen that as an incredible ROI kicker. Even if it is not so much core to the core CDP, it's an incredible ROI accelerator for the enterprise, because now you are, you pretty much get like a 1x on your CDP cost right up front. On just the consolidation. And I think that really leads to the next question really well, which is, does that mean that the CDPs can replace a lot of the other platforms that my business would need? Should I buy a CDP with a data lake and an email automation, or just having a CDP would suffice? A CDP that kind of is a full stack CDP. Do I then need to do other stuff at my end? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you remember that I spent most of my career as a consultant, so I'm going to give the consulting answer, which is it depends. There really is no other answer to that question. I don't, if you're not committed to the existing systems because you don't like your email system, or you're not that fond of it, or of your web personalization tool, or your CMS or whatever, or you're okay with getting rid of it to get the benefits of integration, then yeah, that's great. On the other hand, if you love your CMS and you don't want to get rid of that under any circumstances, then you don't have to buy a CDP with an integrated CMS. Actually, I can't think of any that have an integrated CMS, but an integrated email system is much more common, for example. You just want to buy the one that'll connect to the system that you know and love. So a lot of companies have put a huge amount of investment in building out campaigns in their email system or their marketing automation system. And the thought of converting those to a new marketing automation system that's baked into a CDP is a huge amount of work. And unless there's a really good reason to do that. So what we see that, the only companies that tend to want the CDP to do everything tend to be the mid-tier companies, where the integration costs are really a bigger issue for them because they don't have as many resources and they're not that committed to their other tools, and they're willing to trade the lower integration cost against the pain of getting rid of their existing systems. Bigger enterprises tend to want just a CDP to build profiles, and they'll keep their other tools in place.
Yeah, and maybe one point that I'd like to add here for the person who asked this question is, I think somewhere also it kind of comes down to the purpose. I think typically when you look at it from a data lake standpoint, the purpose tends to be not just the consumer interaction, but maybe other processes that you're dealing with within the enterprise. And therefore, it really becomes a large data store for everything else that the enterprise is doing. Whereas the CDP is a lot more focused from the perspective of the consumer experience or the customer data management. And therefore, almost every deployment where we see a data lake, the data lake is an integration and a destination, a source and destination. CDP is usually not a replacement for the data lake. It's almost always a synergistic relationship between the CDP and the data lake, because the purpose of the data lake is different from the purpose of a CDP. The CDP has a data lake within it, but the purpose is different. So David, do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. The data lake, if one exists, is almost always a source for the CDP. And the CDP takes that data and then refines it and makes it usable for the marketing purposes. Again, the data lake does not contain profiles. The CDP takes the data lake inputs and build profiles and refines it. You can get into all kind of water, analogies about distilling and all that. I'll spare you that, but definitely they are complementary systems.
Right. Okay. We then have a question from Ulrich. The question that we have is really saying, hey, what's the first telltale sign for a company that's trying to sell their product as a CDP when they're really not? And, you and I have had a discussion about this in the past as well. And you've spoken about it as well. And I know that a lot of your real CDP effort is really driven by this, because you've seen this happen. Ulrich then goes on to, I hope I got the pronunciation right of the name, but the person then goes on to elaborate, saying that, hey, some places, some products have said, we've been operating like a CDP for years, but now they come back and say, look, we just launched event streaming, so now we can formally call us as a product, whereas, shouldn't event streaming or something like that have been part of the base table stakes of being a CDP? So kind of really comes back to, what are some of those signs that tell you that even though they call themselves a CDP, they're really not?
Right. Yeah. And I must say that there are very few companies that will have not called themselves a CDP because they didn't have event streaming. Most of them would have just have called themselves that either way, even though indeed real-time event trigger is one of our requirements, one of our checklist items. I would say, well, there's not having a substantial number of connectors. Pre-built connectors would be a bit of a warning sign, because CDPs should be able to connect to a lot of systems, and you can always have an open API and you can always build them custom. But most CDP vendors will have built a fair number of connectors. That would be one thing to look for. Only dealing with online data is something we see a lot. We see a lot of companies that are really quite good at pulling in online data, but they don't really deal with offline data. So that would be sort of a red flag to say, hey, wait a minute. Are you really a CDP, or are you really just something that's simply meant for a purely digital online environment? And nothing wrong with that. If that's your company, if that's the only channel you deal with, great. But usually there's some offline data that's got to get integrated. And honestly, not having an access API, data access API to get the data out of it and make it easy to get the data out of it is another thing I'll be very leery of. We sometimes will say, well, so long as you can produce an export file, we will let that qualify as being, meeting the accessible to other systems part of the definition. But I must say we grit our teeth when we do that. We really would much rather see a data access API or some other similar way to get at the data. If you can query the database directly, that's okay too. But it's got to be fairly easy because, again, a lot of these systems started out really trying to sell a particular application, and the CDP was built to support their application. They haven't properly opened it up to use by other systems. So those would be some of the things that I would take a good look at that would make me nervous. And the simplest, of course, is the data store. Is it sitting on a SQL Server database, on a pure relational database, not a NoSQL database? That makes me real nervous because now how are they handling unstructured and semi-structured data? Can it take a JSON feed? Like a little more technical. If you can't take a JSON feed, I'm really wondering if you're going to be able to do what a CDP needs to do.
Right. In fact, let me add to that, and I kind of build on some of the points that David mentioned, Ulrich, which is, I'd split it back of the envelope. I would basically say 4 things, right, that we also kind of talk about. One is the breadth. You want a CDP fundamentally to be able to give you complete coverage on the breadth of your data, which means that it should allow you to process voice, image, text, structured, unstructured, transaction data, really everything that you have in your consumer business, right? That's number one. The second would be identity, which is, a CDP that cannot deal with anonymous data, not a CDP. So it known anonymous data, pre-login, post-login. Again, a very, very interesting capability that will allow you to decipher this is first-party focus. And a good way to measure that would be social, for example, right? Does the CDP that you're evaluating bring you first-party data from your opt-in interactions on social, or is it only looking at that integration as a retargeting integration and not really bringing in your first-party integration? Very, very good, easy way to decipher whether it's really focused on your first-party data consolidation, because a good true CDP really becomes your first-party data store. And that control is what the CDP needs to deliver. It cannot have leakages on your first-party data. The third, like David said, data portability and insight portability. A CDP is intended to act as your brain in the body. It needs to be really able to assimilate information and then transfer information back to any destination system. And the information is not just the raw data push or the list push. It is about insight portability as well. And that becomes extremely crucial. And the last, and I think this is also a very, very quick dipstick test for you to ask, does this system have a reason for existence if I don't use it for the actual delivery action? Which is, if I don't want to send an email from the system, I don't want to send a text from the system, does it still add any value? And will they still want to be in my stack if I'm not going to use that for the actual delivery action? And that will tell you whether that is a true CDP or it's an automation product, which also has user management. And so these are very, very simple yardsticks. Of course, there's a lot of nuance to all of this. There's a lot more detail when you understand the maturity of these CDPs, and David has a lot of interesting resource on these things. But to me, the fourth one becomes a very, very good way to measure whether it's a CDP that is bringing in full stack capabilities or it's an automation player with user management. And I think that will tell you the reason for existence of the tool. Hopefully that answers. All right, now to the next one. Is it easy to keep the unified customer profile updated, and how long should the data be available for?
Is it easy? Well, it's easy with the CDP and it's hard without a CDP. Is that what I'm supposed to say? It's not easy. No, it's very hard. That's why you need a CDP in the first place, or you need some equivalent system. There's a lot of moving parts to these things. And you got data feed coming in, and it's just talking about the data unification, the identity unification, which is super complicated. There's nuance on nuance on nuance with that stuff, and this has been something that, I'm an old direct marketer by trade, and when I say old, I mean I've been doing it for many years, went back when we were really dealing just with postal addresses. And there's 40 or 50 years of history in learning how to deal with those things. And it's tough. It's not just, oh, it matches or it doesn't match. Even something as simple as an email address, which has to be an exact match, they can be, are they similar? There are multiple, I don't know how many email addresses I have. And how do you realize that they're all me? You need something else, but you also look at formats and things. So there's a lot of complex logic in that kind of thing that you really have to look for to make sense of. So yeah, it's quite difficult to do this right. There was a second part to that question, wasn't there? I forgot it now.
Yeah, the second part is in terms of the how long should the data be available for?
How long should now we're back to it depends, right? As long as you want, and the point of that is, again, there are systems that only keep data for a short amount of time by design. And you need that long-term data to really build a proper customer profile, so you can take the contextual interaction, which is what's current, but then also put in the context of the long-term relationship, which requires the history data. There are some regulatory constraints on how long you can keep it, so you can't just say forever. We used to say forever, and then people pointed out to us that we could be breaking the law if you did that literally. But it should be up to you. The system should be able to keep it forever. It should be up to you to set policies that determine when you throw it away. But and how long you need it kind of depends on your industry. All right, if I'm a healthcare, obviously I need years and years and years of history on my patients. If I'm a retailer, then a year or two might be enough, because my customers' needs change pretty frequently, and what I bought 3 years ago probably doesn't really tell you too much about what I'm going to buy tomorrow. So it depends on the industry as well. But again, the core answer is as long as you want, as long as you need it.
Right. The next question, David, is how can CDPs allow brands to turn anonymous customers to profiles? I could take that, and it's a little more of an operator question, but yeah, I mean, the way to think about the whole identity bit is to go back to that question, saying what is the purpose of identity that you're creating? Is it to take control of your information, or is it to understand the customer so you can go back and have a conversation? And therefore, what you really see here are two components to that process. A, it is the identity creation, and two, the identity resolution, which is how do you then connect. And then there is, of course, the identity enrichment and so on that happen later. Now, most tools, if you look at it in the traditional method in which you looked at identity, which is where a user record would be created, the identity needed to come along with the interaction. In that interaction, for you to go ahead and create an identity, which means that you needed the email to be able to create the record. And that was the starting point of the identity creation. And the tool then would primarily do maybe resolution, which is that if you get into different let's say data sets, the same email ID, your tool would essentially do like a glorified VLOOKUP to say, oh, it is the same user, right? But there was no identity creation process there. It was really just a resolution, and that to a deterministic resolution using these parameters. But when you look at it from a true CDP perspective, that a real CDP needs to have the capability to say, look, whether or not I get a known PI, communication PI vector, like an email or a mobile, I still need to be able to go ahead and create a record. At that point, what the CDP really is doing is it's creating identity. It's creating your first party data set with or without contact vectors. And that becomes the starting point of the CDP. And those identities are the CDP pseudonymous identity vectors for that particular interaction or user, which then get mapped with additional vectors that come from the actual interactions that happen or other data sets that keep coming in. So they come in as enrichment parameters onto the identity, not as the identity creation requirement for you to create a record. What that basically therefore means is that the CDP is basically creating an identity for an anonymous interaction. And therefore, for a CDP, an interaction is an interaction, known or anonymous. The known or anonymous is a dimension of the richness of the data that is happening. It is not the necessary condition for an identity being created. And additional data sets. And again, here, you need a CDP that has the capability for both deterministic and probabilistic identity matching, because it's not about having the same email ID. It is about being able to connect the dots from the breadcrumbs that you have, whether it is your, structured parameters, it is about unstructured matching, it is about campaign connections that you would get, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple parameters. For example, First Hive uses over 50 parameters as part of its algorithms to be able to go ahead and look at identities. So there are different methods in which the identity mapping happens. And so and this is constant and iterative. It is not a point in time. It is not something that happens at the time of the record. It's constantly happening. It's iterative, and it is retrospectively effective, which means from the time the CDP starts creating the trail of identities, you are now constantly aware, and you can retrospectively connect back all behaviors when the identity match happens. Hopefully that answers your question. Of course, we can talk more if you want to have a chat. I'll go to the last two questions now, since we are knocking on time. This is a question that we often face, and I'm sure you've seen this question as well, David, which is, how big of a customer base do I need to have for my business, for my marketing team to feel the need for a CDP? When is a good time to get a CDP? Do I need to get to a certain scale?
Okay, and again, the CDP Institute side of me wants to, yes, of course, everyone needs a CDP. But CDPs are not cheap, and they are complicated. So there are many companies that are too small for a CDP. There are some CDPs, and I don't have any recollection of how First Hive is priced, but $50,000, $60,000 a year, you're not going to find any CDP less than that. Many of the more enterprise grade ones you're going to start $150,000 or $250,000 a year, for your first record, basically. And so not everybody can afford that. Not everybody needs it. All right. If you're only in one channel and really all your data is there, or if you are a small business, many small businesses use these sort of all-in-one systems that really just have one customer record. Effectively, it is a CDP. So, there's no number, but you don't see too many CDP databases under 100,000 customers. It's possible, but you don't see too many. But really, it's like anything else. Are there things you can't do that a CDP will let you do, and what are they worth to your business? And if what they're worth is more than the cost of the CDP, it makes sense. If what they're worth is not, because your business is too small, so the scale isn't there, probably don't. You can still use one, but you can't afford one.
Yeah, what we've seen, again, my practitioner experience prior to starting First Hive as well, has been that typically you would spend a percentage of your overall marketing budget on a tool. And that becomes a good way for you to think about what is my affordability for the tool, and is the tool right for me? A typical good CDP would price you anywhere from 100 to 250,000, like David said, for you to land that CDP to get started. Which means that even if you assume a 5% spend on the CDP of your overall marketing budget, you should be at a certain scale of spending on your marketing budget. So if you don't have that, a traditional enterprise CDP, you will not be able to afford, because your ROIs will not stack up, right? The one thing that I'm happy to share here and is that, for example, for First Hive, we were very focused on trying to get this capability to growth startups in the digital native consumer companies. So, watch out for this space. We're going to be announcing a specific targeted plan for growth phase companies soon, where we are going to be able to bring that at a huge support price for these startups to help them in their own evolution on their customer experience journeys. But typically a CDP unless you're part of a program like this, would start making sense only once you get to a certain scale. The last question, David, is, how are you seeing data-savvy companies use a CDP to monetize their data externally via marketplaces, data products, etc.?
But it's getting it's getting more and more difficult to sell data for privacy reasons. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not too thrilled with people selling data, so I don't look for that. But there certainly are marketplaces where properly consented data can in fact be monetized. If you look at the entire sort of media network, retail media network movement, if you want to call it that, where retailers and others who are not in the business are selling advertising and really selling access to their customers in various ways, that's effectively monetizing your first party data. So there certainly are things that you can do that are within the bounds of what's permitted and what your customers want you to do, that will allow you to generate revenue from your data. Again, I do stress that you really have to worry about making sure that your customers are comfortable with what you're doing and would be comfortable if they knew about it, even if they don't know about it, because that trust is the foundation of these relationships. People are more and more aware today that they are giving you something of value when they give you their data, and that data could be distributed in ways that would harm them in terms of various kinds of frauds and so on. So they really need to be comfortable that they can trust you to keep your data secure and to use it in ways that they would want you to use it and not use it in ways they wouldn't want you to use it. So think long and hard about making sure that you're being transparent and that you're being trustworthy before you try to make any money monetizing that data. And if you can find ways to monetize to do it, as I say, things like selling different kinds of advertising, that's great. But think about if that's the business you're in and what the costs are to that revenue. Probably not the answer you wanted to hear about.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think the way the question is asked, I think there are multiple interpretations possible. So the interpretation that I had is very similar to what David, which is that you have data and you want to be able to monetize that data through marketplaces. The way I'm interpreting it is that, okay, this is like retargeting, DMP kind of monetization piece, or a data enrichment monetization piece that you're looking at. I think that's a little more complicated, but if our interpretation is wrong, then maybe let us know, and then maybe we'll be able to respond better. But thank you for that question. Awesome. David, thank you so much for taking all of those questions. I know we are 7 minutes over time, but this was fantastic. Look forward to doing more of this. And once again, thank you for all the leadership that you provide to the category. And it's a pleasure to have you on our first ever webinar.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Great questions.
All right, Jashan, thank you once again. And everyone on the call, watch out. We do have these very interesting power webinars that we do every month, and we look forward to having you on the next one. And hopefully this was of value. Thank you very much. Have a good one. Bye.